So what a day it's been already. We've explored bold ideas, heard from visionary leaders, and reconnected with the spirit of lifelong learning that brought us together in the first place. And as we heard in this session, we shift our focus to one of the most pressing and defining challenges of our time, climate. But today, we're not just talking about climate risks, we're talking about climate leadership, about voices from the global south who aren't waiting for change, they're driving it. Last but not the very least, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Ambassador Seyni Nafo. Ambassador Nafo is one of Africa's leading climate diplomats and the longtime spokesperson for the African Group of Negotiators on Climate Change. He's not only been at the table for every major global climate negotiation, he's helped shape the agenda. He's served as Mali's climate envoy, chaired the African Adoption Initiative, and has spent the last 2 decades advocating for climate justice, green finance, and sustainable development on behalf of our continent. But what makes Ambassador Nafo truly stand out in his clarity? He speaks truth to power. He challenges outdated models, and he refuses to let Africa be defined by its vulnerabilities. He insists we be seen for our potential. To him, climate action isn't just an environmental imperative, it's an economic one. It's about energy access, food systems, water security, and job creation. It's about designing a future where Africa isn't left behind, but leads from the front. He's sharp, he's fearless, and above all, he's committed. So please join me in welcoming a powerful voice for Africa and relentless force for climate action, Ambassador Seyni Nafo.
Thanks. All right, good afternoon, everyone. I think I've worked for many of you in the room, or at least for your countries, in Paris 10 years ago at the climate COP, which adopted the Paris Agreement. I had the chance of being the lead negotiator for G77 in China, which covers, I think, more than 2/3 of the globe. So I would imagine that everyone in Latin America, in Asia, maybe not Japan, but the rest of Asia, have had the chance to negotiate for you and work with your government and colleagues. I'm co-chairing the Green Climate Fund now, and we have investments. We have, I think, about $60 billion worth of investment in the globe. Very happy to have partnered with IAN to launch this first equity fund. But I don't want to be talking about that today. What I want to do, and I'm not going to be using slides. Actually, what I want to do is to use all the slides we've seen from the beginning of the morning. I mean, Mohammed's slide, Driss' slides, and Ayan's slides to make a point. And the point is, in the next few minutes, I want to tell you why I've dedicated the last 20 years of my life to fight this very silent killer, this very, how would I say, vicious adversary, and what I would be doing in the next 5 years as Africa. So we've had the chance this morning to have a national perspective. Then Ayan gave us a perspective of a private sector company, but which has the whole continent as a scope. And what I deal with as my mandate at a daily basis is to put everything together, put the whole continent together, look at government, look at private sector, look at CSOs, look at subnationals, and see how we put the whole of Africa together to deal with this one. It can be called many things on the continent. It can be called a stress multiplier. It can be called a challenge multiplier, a threat multiplier, because this is what it is, basically. You know, at the first, if you take any African country, you have about 3 main challenges. Development. You know, fighting poverty is your number 1 priority in many governments. You know, access energy, access to basic economic infra, jobs. That's your number 1 priority. Then you have demographics. You know, the continent is growing 3 times faster than the rest of the world. There's dividend, but that can be a massive threat in all kinds of ways. Migration, crime, if it's not dealt with in the right proportion. Peace and security. Unfortunately, we are a continent which still deals with conflict everywhere in every region. In the north, in Libya, in the east, whether right now in Ethiopia, in DRC, in Mozambique, in the Sahel. And the reality with this silent adversary called climate change is that it impacts, is sort of driving and making this extremely volatile. Climate has many kinds of impacts. The increased temperature can lead to increase of humidity, can link to a decrease of ag yield. And we're seeing that on the continent. The variability of weather and the consequence, the variability in rainfall. The agriculture that we have on this continent, as much as I would have wanted every farmer to have an Azura farm, 90% of our farms and of our agriculture depends on rainfall. So when rainfall is unpredictable, it's a mess. And that's what we're having. And most African countries, unfortunately, have 60 to 80% of their labor in agriculture, 30 to 40% of GDP in agriculture, but only 4% of banks. If you check the banks' financing to agriculture, 4%. Why? My dear bankers, the ions of this Africa will tell us agriculture is too risky. We can't invest in agriculture because, again, you don't have hydroponics and all those fancy technologies. So because of all of that, climate makes achieving those goals, those development goals, and everything else makes it even more difficult. The African Development Bank, which is the largest MDB, a multilateral bank on the continent, is already costing climate change as 5% of GDP. This is what it's costing the continent, 5% of GDP. And we're seeing that most African countries don't grow 3 to 5% per year. This is what it's already cost. You don't know it maybe, but Morocco is going through its 6th year of drought. This is the 6th year of drought in this country. If this had been any other African country, you would have seen terrible images on CNN and BBC. And the reason you don't see it is simply because this country has been extremely serious with sustainable agriculture for the last at least few decades. It has 1 million acres of irrigated land. I think a good half of that is under ag insurance. And it has worked on sustainable water management for the last 20 or so years. So you're not seeing 4 or 5 million young children dying because of that. No other African country would have done as good as that. The whole Sahel is flooded year in, year out. In the sea level rise, that's, for instance, one of the impact, again, that we don't see. If you see the continent, Africa has 54 countries. 35 countries have what I call it's 80-20. 80% of the population, 80% of the GDP is on the coast or is going to be on the coast in the next 10 to 15 years. What we have in our climate models for the next 20-25 years is that most of those cities, one-third of those cities could be flooded. Starting from Casablanca to Dakar, down to Lagos, to Libreville. Durban, I think Ayana alluded to that, was already flooded and up. So this is a serious threat, and that's painting the picture. What are we doing about it? And I think that was the point. We're very good in Africa in stating problems. But what are we doing about it? And I want to mention a few of the things that we have done in the last 10 years. At the African Union, which is the political body which unites the 54, climate change is the only theme where we are structured at the technical, ministerial, and heads of state level. So we as technicians, ambassadors, we make recommendations to ministers, they make recommendations to heads of state, and we have heads of state engaging on behalf of the continent. We have now 6 regional and thematic initiatives. We have initiatives on advancing renewable energy, on advancing adaptation to climate change, adapting the agriculture of the continent to climate change. We have initiatives to deal with the Sahel region. This is from Dakar to Djibouti. We have initiatives to deal with the island economy or ocean economy. And we've had 2 years ago, a summit of African heads of state simply on climate change to advance concrete implementation. Because heads of states were tired of hearing that we're vulnerable as much as we are, and we're thinking about how do we advance concretely the investment opportunities that we see on the continent. How do we do that? How do we drive 100% renewable energy? How do we have business opportunities around critical minerals and so forth? Subnationals are getting in the game. We have 14,000 subnationals on the continent. They are getting organized to get into the game as well. That's in the last 10 years. We have accelerated the pace in the last 5. Africa just had a seat at the G20. And many of the challenges that, for instance, Ian articulated, which is this bias and the African, I call it the African premium. All of those financial related negotiations are done at the G20 or at the IMF. Africa didn't have a seat. South Africa had a seat at the G20, but Africa as a continent didn't have a seat. We're just having a seat, and we're having now an opportunity to engage on those discussions. We have now a climate strategy. The IMF only 2 years ago, now when it does its assessment, integrates climate in the macro assessment to try to understand how climate impact macroeconomy. 2 years ago, I was in Nigeria, had a meeting of the central bank, because for the first time, you had droughts in the northern part of the country and floods in the southern part of the country, and this was creating macroeconomic shock. So for the first time, they were realizing, this issue is maybe not about, that's not just environmental, this is not CSO, this actually is a national security issue. It has macroeconomic implication, and we need to integrate that. We need to integrate that as well. I'll stop there with a further perspective to give you the next 5 years are going to be extremely critical for us as the continent, and we've identified what I call a disruptive strategy to deal with some of those challenges. It has 3 pillars. The first one is integration, and I've heard that, integration. How do we link science, policy, and investment? Those 3 words are not connected. Those who are doing science are sitting there. Those who are doing policy sitting in another corner. And those who are putting all of that together to implement project and program on the ground, well, this is where we have the biggest gap on the continent, execution. Morocco is really good at execution. Egypt is good at execution. So we're working now, we're building literally what I call climate investment bankers. So if you take the GCF as a proxy, the GCF, we disburse about $3 billion per year. Africa has 40% of the portfolio, but 80% of those resources are channeled in the continent through non-African institutions. Why? Because we don't have a critical mass. We get to skills and jobs. We don't have critical mass of experts who can literally do that connection. We can link science, policy, and investments. So we're doing a big push in the next few years to train, similar to the kind of program that you've been in, a young professional program. So young women and men, we have the first cohort actually that we'll release in the next few weeks of talented young and women professionals who will train to really design climate investments, to link all of those 3 together and be able to do that. That's one. Second, on energy, we are very excited about a new primary source of energy, which is called geologic hydrogen. Not green hydrogen, not the electrolyzer type. The one type which is drill, which is zero fossil fuel base. Some of the biggest challenge we've had 10 years ago, everybody thought that the continent was going to be fully electrified in the next 10 years. We haven't been able to do that. We have never seen the kind of uptake that we saw with cell phones. Why? Because in cell phones, you have a GSM, you have a standard, a technology standard that you can replicate and you can aggregate and you can scale. This hasn't happened with energy. So we think that this new hydrogen that you can drill, and if you haven't heard about it, that's another topic, but this is a zero carbon molecule that can be drilled, and Africa is really leading in that work. It's quite exciting. And the final point is coalition building. working together, integration, at the national level, the regional level, the continental level, working with private sector, government, and CSOs. That's, to me, the biggest challenge we've had. Development, to some of us, is an organizational engineering challenge. It's not a finance challenge. We have enough financial engineers. It's not a technology challenge. We have enough of that. What we have lacked is what I call really the organizational challenge, which is, this is a systems, if there's systems engineer in the room, it's a system engineering challenge. And the biggest challenge then is how do we put it all together? And that's some of the work that we'll be conducting in the next 5 years to really bring about some serious change. Thank you.
So you've said that when I was reading a little bit on the work that you've done before, you've mentioned that Africa contributes the least to global emissions, but suffers some of the most severe consequences. What do you believe is the most misunderstood truth about Africa's role in the global climate crisis?
Well, I think it's the nature of the phenomenon itself. Climate change resembles, before climate change, I used to work in immunological research. If you take, for instance, the AIDS crisis, climate change is almost like a syndrome. It's everywhere that you can't see it. So it becomes very difficult to, even for policy leaders or practitioners or just the normal lay person to sort of understand. I'll tell you a joke. A few years ago, in one of the very first agroforestry projects on the continent, we visited a village, and I had a colleague who was leading that project in Niger, and his old mother called him because she was in the village, and she said, "I don't understand, my son. I've brought you well, but I hear that now you're selling hair. You're selling fin hair. What do you mean? How can you literally sell fin hair?" So that's sometimes the challenge with climate change. It's not as visible, so that becomes extremely difficult to present it. Second is, this is the only problem where most of the solutions are outside of the continent. Having, for instance, an effective advocacy policy, an effective, putting in place access to antiretroviral drugs can get you very good results when it comes to climate change. When it comes to, for instance, the HIV and not turning the problem into a national pandemic or into a national crisis. Unfortunately, the drivers of climate change are not on the continent. So this is the first crisis that we're dealing with where the drivers, 95% of emissions, are not in this continent. Hence the criticality of not only negotiating with partners, but bringing solutions, but ensuring we are part of the solutions, because the more emissions, the more the cost of adaptation will rise, and so we can't just sit. We have to come up with some of the solutions to deal with the problem. It's unheard of. I don't know any other problem. It's like you are in your home, you have a significant problem, but the problem is caused by the neighbor. And you can't just go out and yell at the neighbor, but the neighbor is causing the problem. But this problem is going to be the most significant problem you have, and yet you're not the driver of that problem. It's somehow, that's the challenge.
But why are we not part of the solution? It seems like, is it because we didn't contribute to the problem in the first place? We're not the most industrialized continent. We're not, obviously. Why does Africa lack that stronger seat at the table?
Oh, we do have a strong seat at the table in terms of some of the very high contributions which have been made to push the negotiation and the agreements that's come from Africa. The only problem is the correlation between GDP growth and emission growth is almost 1-to-1. So the reality is that whilst the rest of the world industrialized in the last 100 to 20 years, that's where the emissions came from, and then created now the problem, meaning there's this tip of the balance now, and we're having now all those impacts. So the reality is there is a limited space, there is a limited carbon budget. We've already exceeded that, and it has been done without Africa industrializing. So as we industrialize, we'll have to think about how we do it in a manner without exceeding the problem. Ian likes to talk about gas. I have that conversation with the government of Mozambique, for instance, which has huge gas reserve. And their anxiety going into the negotiation was, well, this is unfair. We have this huge gas reserve. We should be, we should be allowed to use our gas reserve. I mean, look at Norway. It has the largest pension fund, 1.3 trillion because of oil. So we should be, and our point is not to say that, you shouldn't be using your gas reserve. The reality is that if you don't deal with climate change, you won't have enough oil or gas revenue to deal with the cyclones that you see right now and all those climate disasters which are literally knocking out your infra. So your infra is no longer there, and we're starting to see this more and more on this continent where there's a climate event. The roads are washed away. The transmission lines are washed away. The debt is still on the book, but the infrastructure is no longer there. So the idea is how do you take that reality into consideration by first, for instance, having resilient infra, but at the same time seeing if you can decorrelate the development trajectory with the emission trajectory. That's still the biggest challenge.
You've mentioned the Paris Agreement, COP20, and we know that the US has been in and out depending on administrations. How do we ensure that these agreements translate into action that actually fits African priorities on the ground, from agriculture to energy access?
We develop solutions, and that's what we've been doing for agriculture, for energy. For instance, in Paris 10 years ago, we launched the largest push for renewable energy development on the continent, and we secured significant resources. So that's what we have been doing in the last 10 years. We've had a dual track of negotiating and at the same time coming with concrete implementation, concrete action on the ground to accelerate the implementation. Again, bringing concrete solutions to be able to move. And so I talked about geologic hydrogen, the same thing. You haven't heard much about it, but I can promise you that in the next few more months, you'll start hearing more and more, and those are some of the work that we do on the ground to putting on the table concrete action and measures.
While we're talking about the Paris Agreement, I can't move on without mentioning that Morocco was hosting the COP22 a few years ago. Why do you think that Morocco deserved to have that stage, and what solutions or problems are there that Morocco is trying to contribute to for its country and for Africa as a whole?
Right, that's actually how I was brought to this country in 2016. I chaired the African group of negotiators, and this is how I've met Abir. And this has been a wonderful journey. Morocco has contributed on the two sides on addressing the impact of climate change, for instance, making the agriculture resilient to climate impacts through sustainable water techniques that can, irrigation, through ag insurance. The Ministry of Agriculture is maybe one of, if not the most powerful ministry in this country. So it has been at the avant-garde of advancing agriculture in the 21st century. That's one. Second, same thing on renewable energy. For this country, I believe that accelerating renewable energy deployment was not even for mitigation per se. It was an issue of national security because the country is importing all of that. So it was for national security purposes as well as balance of payment purposes before even mitigation. So here's an example where climate aligned fully with development priorities, and at the same time, it makes economic sense. This is a cheaper option for the country than, for instance, fossil fuel, which even many GCC countries in the Gulf are now, exporting fossil or refined products and then deploying renewable energy at scale because it makes economic sense. It's cheaper, so it does make sense.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ambassador. Any questions from my colleagues? I'll turn it over to you guys now. Bankole, I'm going to pick on you. All right, Yuri.
Thank you for this presentation. I think this is super timely because, as you mentioned, I live in the U.S. U.S. administration has been flip-flopping on the issue. And you guys are trying to solve big global challenge, right, that impacts your country, your continent. How do you, because global warming is a global challenge, right? Like you cannot fix in one country. So what is the practical solution where I would say such a big country as the US and a few other countries just do not do anything about it? Like what can you do that's really practical that will help you with what we've seen in Mozambique as an issue?
I think, and this is to all of us, I think the reason why climate policy has failed is that the world economy or the world as a planet hasn't been able to find an alternative to fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are extremely convenient and practical, and until and unless we find, and this is maybe the challenge to all of you as entrepreneurs, this is the $1 trillion question. Whichever entrepreneur finds an alternative to fossil, which is as practical, as affordable, reliable, scalable, and durable, will eat the $1 trillion jackpot. And there are many, and frankly, you'll be amazed by all the kind of solutions, technology and otherwise solutions which are being deployed. And I think that in the next few years, we can strike a major transformation, because this is what needs to happen for governments to frankly move. Because as I said, GDP, as long as GDP and emissions will be correlated, it's going to be very hard for any government to prioritize climate versus jobs, at least in the reducing the emission part, not in the adaptation. In the adaptation, you're just adapting to the impacts. But on the reducing emission side, we need to find, if not an alternative, at least an option which would allow to grow economically and at the same time address the challenge. And some of us think that we have found at least a very interesting candidate.
Absolutely. I think the way, and it's exactly what you're saying, we need to shift the view from that becoming more climate savvy is actually a cost, but in the opposite is actually a business opportunity where it's good business. We can actually be making money as entrepreneurs and being more climate wary. Ambassador Nafo, thank you very much.
Most welcome.
A true privilege. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur.
Thank you very much.
Infiniment.
Bien sûr.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
On to, I see you walking towards me in